Good morning to all of you, and welcome to this event, this latest SPIN event in our series. For those who are new to SPIN, SPIN is a secrecy, power, and ignorance research network, a group of academics and artists based principally in the southwest of the UK and in Wales, though we really are expanding to other parts of the globe. All of us are generally committed to exploring the social, cultural, and political power of unknowing in its different ways and forms. And this includes supporting research on secrecy, on intelligence work, on conspiracy theories, on knowledge and ignorance in the ways that those operate in the world, and a host of other cognate concepts and issue areas. So today I'm very pleased to welcome two speakers, and I hope you'll see how their work fits together in interesting ways. So we have Professor Linsey McGoey from University of Essex and Professor Perry Zern from American University, though currently working out of Cornell. So Professor Linsey McGoey is Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, working in social theory and economic sociology. She's recognized internationally for playing a pioneering role in the establishment of ignorance studies, an interdisciplinary field focused on exploring how strategic ignorance and the will to ignore have underpinned economic exchange and political domination throughout history. Her work has appeared in a range of publications, including the books No Such Thing as a Free Gift on the Gates Foundation and The Unknowers on the Political and Economic Importance of Ignorance. And she's also a founding editor with colleagues of the Routledge Research in Ignorance Studies book series. And I really haven't done her justice in that introduction.
Well, thanks, Elspeth, so much for that incredibly generous introduction. Really happy to be here with you all. Looking forward to the Q&A after our talks. I'm trying something a little bit old-fashioned today in that it's some new material for me. So I decided to write out my remarks, and I'll hopefully deliver them in not too monotonous a manner, but I'm going to read this paper that shouldn't be any longer than 18 or 20 minutes at the most. And then after Perry's talk, hopefully there'll be a nice chance for us both to make connections and to have a great discussion with you all. While I'm reading too, I won't necessarily be watching you. I'm looking at the text on my screen. So if you need to get my attention, by all means, interrupt, ask a question. Just let me know if anything's gone wrong on the technology on your end. Does that sound good? You guys can let me know yes or no, or I'm imagining there's been yeses and probably
Yes.
thumbs up that I didn't see. So don't do that next time. You have to speak up next time. That was the point. Do we have modern oracles? Do we have oracles today in our contemporary secularized societies in the same way that the ancients relied on oracles, traveling to sacred places like the Temple of Apollo in central Greece to consult the Pythia at Delphi, the famous medium to the gods? At first glance, the answer seems to be clearly no. Oracles in the sense of supernatural entities are not used as tools of modern forecasting in the way they were in the past. Our world today is not seen as an oracular one. And in both classical and modern social theory today, oracles are treated as less than an afterthought. Even the writing of Weber and Durkheim on religion did not pay much attention to oracles. Weber saw the birth of modernity as characterized by a clear evolutionary movement towards more rationalized forms of judgment that he placed in opposition to the mystical realm of oracular consultation. And for Durkheim, interestingly, the words oracular and oracle don't feature at all in his elementary forms of religious life. It's a fascinating omission of a key ordering device. Anthropologists have studied oracles in depth, but they've also largely seen oracles, as Weber did, as more characteristic of pre-industrial and non-Western realms. In short, oracles are neglected in social theory. And some might say that that's fine because they are not tools of judgment today in the same way they were relied upon in the past. But the point of my current work is to suggest that this neglect and dismissal is unfounded. It thwarts the possibility of developing a broad cross-sectoral conceptual framing of expert authority and opinion leaders that's needed today, a time when both old and new forms of anti-democratic hierarchy are hardening and gaining in reverence across the world. So in my current work, I'm trying to develop a general social theory of the oracle. This work is under contract for a short monograph with the University of Toronto Press, and it's due out in 2026. The goal of the book is to explain why a general theory of oracular power is important for exploring political and distributional matters. I suggest that a better understanding of which groups function as oracles today is crucial for understanding why some people can maintain power and status while others can't. It's useful for theorizing and challenging the unequal and uneven allocation of power and resources across different groups. So in the talk, I'll first start with some definitions, and then I want to introduce a new schematic approach that I'm trying to develop in order to theorize different forms of oracular authority. And then I'll apply that schema to a particular type of expert, which is the modern economist. So if anyone searches online for what an oracle is today, you'll find a series of definitions that typically goes something like this. 1, a priest or priestess acting as a medium through whom advice or prophecy was sought from the gods in classical antiquity. 2, a place at which divine advice or prophecy was sought. 3, a person or thing regarded as an infallible authority on something. And for a long time, the first two definitions have generally crowded out and trumped the third definition, a person or thing regarded as an infallible authority. And in my argument, I aim to reverse that order of priority. I suggest that definition number 3 needs to be upheld as the foundational way to conceive of an oracular entity. And what's more, I argue that defining oracles in this way lets me make new points about the nature of expertise, distributional power, and control over the future in both secularized and religious realms. So building on that third definition, I define an oracle as any entity or group seen as the highest authority on the unknown in a particular community or historical era. And I first introduced that definition in my last book titled The Unknowers. And my argument then and now is that all societies have layers and hierarchies of ignorance, and oracles are whichever groups or artifacts are placed at the peak of such hierarchies, trusted as guides on how to act and treat others when living with profound uncertainty. I also pointed out that the main reason why the role of oracles as a source of power is under-recognized in social theory today is because most modern oracles are latent ones. The authority of today's oracles is not manifest, but rather typically latent and implicit, and in a way that can make their oracular authority even harder to identify, to dislodge, or to challenge. The distinction I make between manifest versus latent oracles helps me to explain what different authoritative entities in vastly different realms, from the financial markets to churches, for example, have in common. A priest or a cleric, for example, isn't an expert in the scientific sense, but a cleric clearly does legitimate the righteousness of different social actions by sanctifying different courses of action as morally righteous or morally egregious. Similarly, part of the scientific appeal of economists is that they appear to make neutral judgments about the economic advantage of different actions. They purport to make scientific claims, not moral ones, but they can still make economic choices appear either blameworthy or excusable, and therefore they obviously have moral effects, especially when it comes to feelings of shame or forgiveness around personal or national debt. But what I think we need is a framework that can hold both types of legitimation, both types of that particular sort of legitimation actor in the same typology, and not bifurcate them in the way that, for example, Weber does in seeing charismatic authority as distinctive from legal bureaucratic domination. So I'm trying to create a framework that allows for cross-historical theorizing about the nature of judgment itself in ways that link to formal modes of adjudication, including court and jury judgments, which also includes religious diktats, financial market punishments, and social media policing. And I argue that the defining shared trait of all oracles is that they are a type of judgment machine, making subjective decisions more palatable to other people by recasting human choices as more seemingly objective. And thus the implication is more inevitable and less deliberate and willful than they really are. And this helps me to make new points about the long history of objectivity, contesting the post-Enlightenment newness attached to scientific objectivity by philosophers of science in recent years. So my argument is contrary to that of Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, who argue that objectivity as a virtue is in many ways unique to the modern scientific era. I also argue that inanimate and other non-human entities can have strongly oracular functions. A Fitbit, for example, is a type of oracular device. When the opacity of one's own body and mind makes them a constant source of anxiety for us, the invisibility of some of our own processes to ourselves, a source of intractable unknowns. An arbitrary number like 10,000 daily steps has the oracular function of lending objective credibility to self-care efforts, even though most of us are aware that if we reach 9,000, it's really not too distinctive from the 10,000 on a daily basis. And I know a lot of people berate themselves, though, if they don't reach that magical number for some reason. So even those of us who are aware from Foucault and others about the subjective nature of classificatory systems still tend to subscribe to them. The visibility of the voting booth also has a clear oracular function, signaling to a community the righteousness of procedural steps and of proper adherence to a democratic, transparent process. And I suggest that the variability in the breadth of oracles is not an arbitrary fact, nor negligible conceptually. Rather, this breadth is core to their social usefulness, because the power to enact new oracles or to enhance one's own oracular authority is essentially non-monopolizable. Oracular power, in short, can have an emancipatory quality to it. It can also be oppressive, because even though periodically new oracles do emerge, historically, different forms of forecasting power and truth claiming tend to be monopolized by particular oracles for very long periods. Today, for example, that function is largely dominated by mainstream economists with oppressive implications for society, because economic authority can and is being used to legitimate grossly unfair wealth gaps in society, as well as to excuse and to legitimate the growing control of the economy by the financial sector. I turn to the case of economists in greater detail in a minute. But first, I want to address a key question. Can anything or anyone be an oracle? This is something I'm still thinking about. I don't know the answer to that, and I hope you might help me to theorize that question. But I answer it provisionally as follows. In some ways, the answer is yes. A wide range of objects and people can have oracular authority. The Bible and the US Constitution are both hailed in different ways as definitive when it comes to moral and political decision-making. People exploit the constitutional case or the biblical case for a decision, just as ancient statesmen would earn themselves political capital by visiting Delphi before undertaking any major endeavor. Just by silently holding up a Bible during his campaigning, the former president and current candidate, Donald Trump, signals a sort of theocratic affinity with conservative Christians. And importantly, too, his power is not limited to rarefied, hard-to-buy objects or to elite social actors. Often mundane, widely commercialized goods possess this oracular power, like the Fitbit or the Bible that you can still find in most American hotels and elsewhere. And I quite like the Bible, so I like reading it when I'm in one. But the widespread availability of it is itself obviously an interesting but somewhat neglected fact in today's purportedly secularized realms. Crucially, however, the human being brandishing the Bible or the salespeople hired to sell Fitbits rarely convey the same sense of trueness in themselves as the device or the text that they wield. Rather, one of my key points is that any oracle needs to achieve metahuman status to be seen as authoritative. And this is my main provisional response to the question I just posed. Yes, in theory, anything can be oracular, but in practice, the obfuscation of one's humanness is a sort of magic that must materialize for the authority of the oracle to hold. Expanding on this point, one of my goals is to try to develop a general theory of the oracle that through a schematic approach, one that's I feel and hope might be useful to theorize why different oracular authorities continue to wield power over decision making, even when their predictions or pronouncements turn out to be wrong, or when their humanness can't be hidden. So in my forthcoming book, I'm introducing a typology for theorizing oracular power. And that typology has 4 elements. I'm moving into my last sort of 7 minutes. Hybrid publicity and secrecy, metahuman credibility, mimetic adjudication power, and non-monopolizability. Now, I don't have time to describe each component today. I barely had time to say them all. I know they're slightly mouthfuls, thinking about whether some of these neologisms need simplification. But for now, I'll focus on 2 elements in that schema: mimetic adjudication power and non-monopolizability. So I realize the term mimetic adjudication power might sound very jargony, but I think it's quite obvious once it's defined, and it's sort of my own neologism, so don't worry if you haven't come across it before. But I define it as the capacity to absorb and even to benefit from previous errors through the institutional right to arbitrate upon and correct one's own mistakes. It's quite simplistic, but I think it has useful implications. Because of this mimetic adjudication power, the most respected oracular authorities in any society usually have, at least for a period, a centripetal quality, moving in a circular manner in a center-seeking way. So at the social level, such entities reinforce themselves through the epistemic and institutional advantage of being the highest form of adjudication on their own earlier failed predictions. And all oracles work like this. It's a mimetic pattern that's observable yet under-theorized across many social, economic, and policy realms. For example, in Michael Power's work on auditing systems, where he notes that individual auditors are often blamed for an auditing failure in ways that actually strengthens and reinforces the system itself, because there's a need for more auditors to resolve earlier errors, the previous one. Indeed, as he put it, the great puzzle of financial audit is that it has never been a more powerful and influential model of administrative control than now, when many commentators talk of an auditing crisis, end of quote. And parallels are visible in societies where oracles are worshipped in a manifest way, including in ancient Greece and pre-industrial Zandian society in Central Africa. At times, a false or unproven prediction might generate some mistrust in specific oracles, causing reputational risk, but this simply leads to a reinforcement of the authority of the oracular system writ large, as different oracles are consulted and depended upon even more by petitioners, the more that earlier prophecies are felt to have led community members astray. This was a point made by the influential anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard, whose work with the Azandi people led to important anthropological insights on oracles. He pointed out, to quote, Azandi are only skeptical of particular oracles and not of oracles in general. As an institution, to quote, there's little chance of the oracle being proved wrong. The same could be said of mainstream economics, where rightly or wrongly, much more than other social sciences, practitioners are perceived to have a high degree of depersonalized expertise. Their policy guidance is rarely experiential or anecdotal, but apparently rooted in objectively verifiable statistical claims, thus enhancing the moral authority of their claims to objectivity. And of course, whether mainstream economics does succeed in depicting processes of wealth accumulation and distribution in a neutral way is very much in doubt. In the 1950s, for example, the economist Joan Robinson suggested that the dominance in neoclassical economic teaching of the concept of the production function has been a powerful tool of miseducation. End of quote. And to define it briefly, the production function is the principle that factor returns to either the owners of capital or workers largely accord to the economic value generated by each factor of production. It's an axiom in mainstream thought first developed by economists such as John Bates Clark, who contributed to the marginal turn in the late 19th century. This marginal turn is a much studied paradigmatic shift in economics that led to a displacement of earlier labor theories of value, theories that were predominant not just in Marxist thought, but in classical scholarship as well, from people like Adam Smith. Prior to the marginal turn, as Pistor and others point out, there was wider recognition within the mainstream of the state's role in facilitating legal mechanisms of dispossession and wealth concentration. Following the marginal turn, the amassment of wealth still owed, as the legal scholar Katerina Pistor puts it, just as much to the state and its laws as its predecessors, only now this nexus was denied. Mainstream economics, which helps to blanket the state's role in enriching the wealthy at the expense of other people, like especially renters and debtors, has a high degree of mimetic power. It's not as if the measurement weaknesses and the distributional blind spots are not widely known or if they're kept secret, but rather that the same oracles are constantly returned to adjudicate past mistakes. So to come to a conclusion, does this mean that the power of mainstream economic theory is unchallengeable? Not necessarily. As wealth inequality skyrockets in most nations today, criticism of mainstream economics is gaining steam, just as it did in the early 20th century. And this relates to the last point of my schema that I want to touch on here, which is non-monopolizability. And I have a longer argument where I essentially try to argue that oracles are less monopolizable than God, but I won't get into this now. I just want to try to raise the point, and perhaps in the discussion period, we can come back to it. But I think even though they're very durable, they're not monopolizable. And that's why oracles, which act as a sort of liaison between people and the gods, whether secular or not, is what distinguishes them so much from a pure deity, which is inaccessible to human beings. So I see oracles as by nature non-monopolizable. While they might have institutional resilience, their structure and their durability is not assured nor incontestable. And today, the orthodox power of mainstream economics is starting to wane. And this ebbing can be made and linked to an important point made by the anthropologist David Zeitlin about oracular trust and credibility. He writes that an evaluative test for diagnosis and divination more generally is not whether it is correct, but whether it helped. Today, a time of double-digit inflation in many countries and growing wealth gaps, the orthodox insistence that factor returns are a neutral reflection of one's economic contribution are not any less false than they were during the 1980s or the 1990s. The problem is that they no longer help or seem plausible to growing numbers of people. The more that people can't heat their homes, the more insecure and fragile dominant oracles then become. New oracles are now being born. Thank you.